Nosso próximo palestrante, como podemos ver na tela já, é um palestrante internacional. Mas antes, não sou eu que vou chamá-lo ao palco, não. Quero chamar aqui o Felipe e o Jaidson, porque eles vão entregar um prêmio para esse palestrante, porque é uma ocasião especial. Uma salva de palmas para os nossos queridos organizadores. Mas, gente, que isso? Não querem que tenha ano que vem, não? Ó.
E aí, pessoal? Tudo bem? Rapidinho, então, antes de chamar o Mike aí, então, a gente queria dar um prêmio para ele. O Felipe está com um prêmio aqui, que é um kit BrazilJS. Eu vou falar em português, porque o Mike entende muito bem português, fala melhor que eu, até inclusive português. E não sei se vocês se lembram ou acompanham o histórico aí, a gente já falou aqui da primeira BrazilJS hoje, né? O Mike Taylor palestrou na primeira BrazilJS também em 2011, lá em Fortaleza. Né, Felipe?
Além disso, ele também é um dos palestrantes que mais palestraram na BrazilJS. Ele está presente pela 4ª vez, então. E isso é uma coisa muito legal.
Esse aqui não é o Mike Taylor, né?
Esse aqui é o Fox.
Mas então a gente queria chamar o Mike Taylor agora no palco, com muitas palmas. Muitas palmas. Uhul! Dá o prêmio. Quarto, o ano passado ele entrou, inclusive, com um crachá, ele escreveu Brandon Nike. Então, para quem, só esclarecer, esse é o Mike Taylor, não o Brandon Nike, mas...
He's more Brazilian than me.
Então tá, vamos deixar o Mike agora.
Yeah, this is good. Okay, that was totally embarrassing. All right, so again, I'm going to do this in English because I never learned how to speak programming in Portuguese. Okay, so we're gonna do this fast. So for the next 24 hours, you can download Firefox for free. If you use the code BrazilJS. Vlad, where's Vlad? Vlad felt like I should tell you that was a joke, and it's always free. Okay, so enough with jokes. This is a super serious talk. Okay, so my name's Mike. I live in Texas, which is currently underwater. And I work on web compatibility at Mozilla. And we're going to learn a little bit about what that means, but not really. That's not the focus of this talk. I'm a designer, and I have a blog. I'm available for freelance if you want to. I charge very reasonable rates. Anyway, so I work on a website with my team called webcompat.com, and you can go there and you can file bugs, and that's fun. So sometimes I work on this spec compatibility standard, which is through the What Working Group, and we're not really going to talk about that, but if you want to check it out and help me fix bugs, that'd be great. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about is weird browser APIs. Yeah, like they're all weird, probably you're thinking, but why should you care about weird browser APIs? Like I work on a browser, I work on Firefox. You might not. So here's why I care about it, right? You know I work on WebCompat, so I care about interop. Like I want the app you write to work in Firefox, I want it to work in Chrome, I want it to work in Edge, Safari, like that's why we love the web, right? That's the dream. The platform should be predictable. You should be able to write code and have it do the same thing over and over again. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And I care about WebCompat. And so that means just like websites should work in the browser that you want to use it in. So raise your hand in here if you write patches for a web browser. Holy cow, that's awesome. I might be at the wrong conference. Just kidding. Okay, raise your hand if you work on a web app or site. And if you don't, just raise your hand anyways, because it feels good. Okay, so why should you care about weird APIs as a developer or an aspiring developer? So I'm not actually going to tell you yet. So we're gonna learn about a bunch of weird stuff. Apologies to the translators. I get excited. Okay, so there's this document. I think you should all Google this or Bing it or whatever. Client-side API design principles. And this was written by the TAG. This is the W3C Technical Architecture Group. And this was written for spec authors. And so they're saying if you're going to write a browser API, follow these principles. And so we're gonna see what they recommend, and we're gonna see how browsers have failed at this over the years. And then hopefully we're gonna see how we can apply that to your own work, how you could do better than a browser. Okay, so side effects. This is also a talk about some choices you've made. No, that's a joke. Nobody does drugs. Okay, observable side effects. When you're programming, your program, if you're running a function or whatever, it should not touch outside state, right? It should only play in its own sandbox, and it should always return the same thing. And that's called, right? Yeah, anyways, you guys can read that later. That's more or less the notion there, don't touch the outside world and always return the same thing. So here's an API where this fails spectacularly. Window show modal dialog. Raise your hand if you've ever typed or used that API, and you've just outed yourself as a dinosaur. This doesn't actually work in any browser today. This has been removed from all browsers, but we're going to learn about what it did do. So you can see on line 2, when you would call, so you would say, you would assign the return value of window show modal dialog into this variable. You'd give it a reference to some HTML that has the little pop-up dialog you're going to show. You could pass some args if you want. But what's crazy is this actually halts JavaScript execution. It's like throwing a debugger statement into your app. Nothing else on the web platform could do this. You couldn't do anything else until you interacted with that modal dialog. And if your dialog wanted to return something back, this is almost like a super ghetto post message. You could assign this window return value, and it could give back some data, right? So that's bogus. That should feel weird. And this is actually gone. So a friend of mine, Matthias, he wrote a blog post about how okay, we're removing this from Blink. In Firefox, we actually accidentally just broke it and decided to not fix it. I like to develop that way as well. And you can read about, so some really smart people, Adam Barth in particular, he's talking about there's actually security repercussions. If you're pausing entire JS execution, you have to keep that on the stack, and if you can kind of sneak your way in there, all hell breaks loose. So it's gone and it's dead. And over time, you can see people stopped using this. These are stats in Chromium. API usage more or less was dead by 2015. Raise your hand if you were born before 2015. That was a weird question. All right. Just making sure we're all awake. Okay, so that's weird, but it's dead, right? You don't have to worry about show modal dialog. Another method that, it's non-deterministic, it doesn't always return the same thing as math.random. Just kidding. Okay. I'm just going to talk a lot of nonsense until it's time to go home. Here's a real API. Okay, the other ones were a joke. Okay, so if you want to get the position, the scroll top position of a document, right? You may or may not know if a page has been scrolled, and you want to find out where it's at, because you need to do some kind of cool scroll effect or whatever. I don't know what you're trying to do. There's a couple ways you can do this, and it's hard to know which one is correct. So line 2, you could check scroll top on the document element, which that's in the DOM, that's how you reference the HTML. Or you could check it on the body. Or you could do line 6 and be I'm not sure how this works. This is code you see all the time. You may have written it. And what's even crazier is it matters. It depends on if you're in Quirks mode or not. In Quirks mode, if you don't remember, it's the way the browser changes rendering based on if it has a doc type or not. And it exists to be compatible with super old, crappy websites. So you can see here, lots of userland code has to take this into account. So here's some Clojure code, Google library. So they're saying WebKit has this bug where it returns the wrong thing, and so we have to say okay, If we're not WebKit and we're not in Quirks mode, return the HTML element because that's what the spec says to do. Otherwise, return the document body. Okay, so how do you when you have APIs that return different things depending on which browser your user is using? That's a mess. And so, like, what's the solution here? One of the solutions is just like invent a new API. And so the Google folks proposed this scrolling element API, which is great. We're going to all become C++ programmers right now. So you can, this is really easy to understand. So this is code from Gecko. And so this says, first, if we're in Quirks mode, return the body element, right? That's what the spec says to do. Otherwise, return the root element, which is the HTML element. So basically, just like do the right thing all the time. And so it doesn't matter if your user is in old Safari or new Blink. You can use this scrolling element, and you'll always get the thing that you want all the time. Okay, side effects, not cool. Don't rely on them. Be consistent. Don't change state. Okay, so let's learn about consistent casing rules. Raise your hand if you've ever had an argument on your team about how you should like name your variables, or do we use camel case? Do we use, yeah, only Jim is being honest. Only guy in the back who's being honest. You've all like been annoyed at pull requests, right? You're just like, oh, we don't use underscores. But like the guy who uses Python insists on it. So this, on the web platform, we have these conventions. So we use camel case for methods and properties, and we use Pascal case, which is a fancy way of saying that. We do initialisms in APIs, so HTML collection, right? So all the initials should be uppercase, and etc. Let's pause and talk about the RTCD TEMF sender API. This one's really important. I don't know if this joke's going to land, but let's skip it. So that was called a hot take. So the real-time communication dual-tone multi-frequency sender, it's a real thing. We don't care about that. But so here's where, you know, we have these ideals, and here's where it breaks down, right? Like XHR, XML HTTP request, that doesn't follow what we want to do. HTML element, also not great, right? Here's where it gets really weird. Vendor prefixes. If you know anything about me, I don't enjoy vendor prefixes, and I'll show you why. I don't like vendor prefixes for a number of reasons, but one of them is because it's really easy to introduce bugs. You have all these various browser engineers, and can you spot the bug? Take a second. Take one more second. Okay. Oh, did it not work? Okay. Let's look at, this is the IDL. Let's look again. Okay. Does anyone know what's going on? It's okay if you don't. The unprefixed request full screen, you see how the S in the screen is capitalized? But the prefixed ones sometimes are capitalized and sometimes aren't. Microsoft did the lowercase. So that's kind of weird. That's not great. And usually when we write prefix code, we just assume we're like, okay, you know, write the WebKit thing, and then Moz and O and MS, and then the unprefix. You just assume it's going to work in the future, when in reality, like, shit breaks. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word. Sorry. Okay, good luck unprefixing, right? Like this, like we actually probably will never unprefix the full screen API because of that. That's bogus. So this is another place where casing gets weird. CSS object model getters. The CSS object model is the lesser known of the object models, but it's pretty good. Okay, so that's just how you like access CSS stuff through the DOM. Okay, so what do the getters for the following CSS props look like in the CSS object model? We have to read the spec, okay? We're going to like learn some algorithms, and it's going to be great. Okay, so in the IDL, the interface definition language for the CSS style declaration interface, it talks about this camel case attribute, and it references a very specific algorithm called the IDL attribute to CSS property algorithm. You can say that 3 times fast. And so here is the algorithm. Okay, we're not going to read this because that would be terrible. But we're gonna try to write this in JavaScript because that's why we came here. Okay, so let's define a method called CSS prop to IDL. We know we're going to need a property to pass in, like font size, and I just happen to know that we need a lowercase flag so we can decide what happens. Okay, so step 1, let output be the empty string, right? So we've got this empty variable. Let uppercase next be unset. So that's just we're setting a variable with no value. It's undefined. Doesn't matter what we put. Step 3, if the lowercase first flag is set, remove the first character from property. Okay, so if you pass in this lowercase first flag, you're going to pop off that first one. And this will make sense in a second, I promise. It might not make sense. And then we're going to loop over every single one of these characters. This is a bit like Mariko's talk, right? We're like doing lexical parsing. I think those words sounded like the right words to say. If we run into a dash, set the uppercase next first, okay? So you remember font size has a dash, font, dash size. That's what it is in CSS. So we already can think like, okay, if we run into a dash, and we're trying to get the JavaScript property name, that's probably going to be, we're going to have a capital letter next. And that's what this code means, that 0x002d. Otherwise, unset that value and just like append the rest of the junk there in uppercase. And then return it. Okay. So that was too much algorithm, and I apologize. You didn't come here for that. And the end result is, if you run this JS, which I could do, but that seems boring, it's just going to return this, right? So in JavaScript, you can do like element.style.font size with a capital S. Cool. That's uncontroversial. If you have a vendor prefixed thing, it's a capital M, Moz transform. Did anybody know that? No, right? Nobody knows that. That's like what Modernizer does. That guy knows that. Okay. WebKit, right? This should be the exact same thing, right? Moz, WebKit, yep, normal. But it turns out, like, if you keep going into the spec, you'll notice there's this thing called a WebKit case attribute. And it turns out you kind of have to special case it because, you know, browser vendors are people too. We make mistakes. And whoever was implementing this in WebKit made a mistake. And so you pass in the lowercase first flag set. So browsers have to support capital WebKit transform and lowercase WebKit transform. And since I added it to the spec, all browsers have to support that. Okay, if you want to know why, you can come back and click on this link if you have access to the slides. And I can explain it to you afterwards. Why don't I just explain it to you right now? Basically, so there's maps libraries that are super popular, Leaflet.js and others, and Android native browser unprefixed CSS transforms, but they forgot to unprefix the event name, and so it broke, and they did stuff, and now we're all in trouble. Okay. There's also this other thing called the dashed attribute, which says, you know what, you don't have to lowercase or uppercase anything. You have to just like support it that way. So you can actually do that, and it works in all modern web browsers today. Thank the Google Maps teams. Maps engineers are awesome, right? Like all kinds of maps. All right. Everyone take a deep breath. That was like really intense. Boolean traps. What does that mean? It sounds really cool, but there's this awesome blog post by a man by the name of Arya. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he works on some cool projects. You've probably used them, like Phantom.js and Esprima, maybe. I'm just making up words at this point. Okay, so he wrote this blog post, and this is like a really cool API design advice. Okay, has anyone ever seen code like this? This is like This is how you create a synthetic mouse event, how you dispatch. You could dispatch a click event with this, okay? So we're going to have a little quiz, right? In my pocket, I have 2 VIP tickets to the party tonight. Can anybody tell me what the 13th false means? Nobody? Bummer. All right, it's meta key. So I guess I have to go to the party tonight. But I'm actually probably going to be asleep. All right. So that's like a Boolean trap, right? We're passing in, you have to pass in true, false, true, false. Like nobody remembers that. When you're designing an API, if you require people to pass in like 8 falses in a row, you're in trouble. Nobody can remember that, okay? So that's gross. So how do you do this, right? We like objects, we like constructors, we like object dictionaries or init dictionaries or whatever, and so that's super memorable. You'd be like, oh yeah, I only need to pass in the meta key. It's true. Everything else is a default. I can ignore it, and that's pretty great. Stringy APIs. So these, what I mean by stringy APIs are if your API, if everything you're passing in is a string, that's bad news, right? Strings are terrible, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. I know, like as web developers, all we do is put strings together. It's like, think about it. Literally, your job is putting strings together. Deep sigh. It's okay. But don't design APIs like this, right? So this is exec command, which is weird. And this is how you can do like rich text editing on the web, and it's terrible, and you should never use it. But if you want to do that, you know, so like Thunderbird is a mail application, and it uses a lot of this stuff. And if you want to insert a line break when you hit enter as you're composing your emails, it does one of these in the background. And so, like, it's just not great. I'm not a fan. Here's another example of where strings have failed the web platform. There's this old API, which you probably don't remember. This was, like, I wasn't using web browsers when people were making this. Document implementation has feature. And so the idea here was, you know, so today we do feature detection in theory, right? We all love feature detection. Everyone's nodding. Yes. Did someone say no? Super rude. I want to know if the browser supports Core 2.0. That's actually DOM Core. You know, like, that's useful to know if the browser supports add event listener, so DOM Core 2.0. And so I'm going to ask the browser, do you support DOM Core 2.0? And it's going to say true. Of course I do, right? And then I'm going to say, do you support lol version 14? It's going to say true. Let's look at some C++ again so we feel hardcore. So this is the implementation in Gecko, and it's the same in all browsers. Like, okay. So I don't know a lot of C++, but let's look at this method, okay? So I've got I can pass in a feature and a version, and I've got this out return value, and it's always true. It doesn't matter. And the reason why this exists today, and this is what the spec says to do, is because browsers started cheating. They started lying. Developers started doing this thing where it's like, oh, if you don't support DOM Core 3, you can't look at my DHTML site, right? And so people started gaming the system using strings, and eventually strings are meaningless. So if you look at the spec here, there's a comment. I think I have a sweet laser. There we go. It says useless, always return true. There we go, laser on the other side. Okie doke. So user agent strings are another stringy API that are terrible, and I don't know how good we are on time. We're going to skip the historical tour of user agent strings. If you feel sad about that, I'm really sorry. But strings are terrible. Just remember that, okay? Okay, so now we're kind of coming to a close of the talk. Why should you care about weird APIs? So this is my theory. I look at a bunch of broken web pages, but I also write some broken web pages. And in the ones I author, like I totally believe if you can design APIs in a way that are consistent, it's predictable, right? So you have a new team member come on, and they don't have to learn a bunch of crazy different stuff. I mean, they will no matter what, but you You can imagine, this is why people love frameworks. You can learn React.js in a weekend, and you can go to the next job, and you can kind of just like jump in and be productive. With a nice API, that's possible. This is kind of why the jQuery API is so successful, right? Like we all love jQuery because it can chain and it's predictable, and then hipsters hate it for other reasons. In theory, you'll have less bugs if your stuff's predictable. In theory, because I write bugs all the time. And then you accrue less technical debt. And then I don't know how to do transitions, so that's kind of broken. So we're going to do a test here. If I go like this, pass. Does that work? We're trying to understand like where the memes start and end in Brazil. So, all right. Thank you very much. I'm Mike Taylor.